I have to be honest, I have a bit of a confession to make. It's slightly uncomfortable, but I think many of you can probably guess what's coming. And that is, can't believe I'm going to say this, but after being gluten-free for 16 years, I'm no longer gluten-free. In fact, I haven't been gluten-free for almost a year now. I've mentioned it in passing on social media. I've mentioned it in other episodes of the Healthy Skin Show, but I am officially declaring that I am no longer gluten-free. This is a big deal. I mean, if you didn't know that I was like a really staunch advocate of being gluten-free and basically evangelized why everyone should cut gluten out of their diet for a really, really long time, then you probably can understand why it's a big shift. And I thought I should come out and just be honest about it. I've literally put up quite a number of photos of sourdough croissants on my Instagram page. I want to talk today about what that journey has been like, what really moved me to consider reintroducing gluten, and how I did it, and how I would recommend and suggest you do that if this is something that you feel called to. If you had asked me even 2 years ago, if I saw myself eating gluten again, I would have laughed in your face. So that's why the idea of coming on here and sharing that I'm back to eating gluten, I mean, not all the time, not necessarily every day, but yes, I eat gluten now, just seems so kind of surreal. Because for the longest time, I had been convinced that gluten was the devil. Part of it came from working with a nutritionist back in 2008 who took one look at my intake form and was like, have you ever heard of something called gluten? As I was dealing with like terrible brain fog, tons of weight gain, extreme fatigue, just like didn't look nor feel well. And lo and behold, taking gluten out seemed to really help. And it became proof to me, so much so that it became literally my identity. I started a whole website around it called Gluten-free School, which I am so glad to not have that website anymore. And then I got to meet a lot of other people in the functional medicine space that reinforced this narrative that gluten was inherently bad for us, that it was responsible for every single health woe. If you have it, it's because you eat gluten. And unfortunately, while that narrative does still persist to this day, I think there are people, especially professionals, many of whom are in more the nutrition space, that are starting to turn back towards realizing that there's a better way. And that was part of my journey. I've talked about being able to reintroduce eggs, 100% of dairy. There's no type of dairy that isn't in my diet anymore. And lastly, this was kind of the last lingering thing, was gluten. And I'll be honest with you, I think the main reason I kept it out wasn't just to prove a point. It was because I was afraid. It was a fear that came from all of the years of talking to people who, at least to me on the surface, seemed deeply convinced that gluten was a huge, huge problem. Now, funny enough, I had another podcast before this called the Gluten-free School Podcast, and I interviewed a lot of experts on the show about issues with gluten, issues with wheat. I interviewed celiac disease research, Dr. Alessio Fasano, on the show. And you know what's the question I never asked him? I never asked him if he ate gluten. I assume yes, but I never actually asked him. I don't know if he's still practicing today, but he had done so much research in Italy and here in the United States on celiac disease. And he also looked at non-celiac gluten sensitivity and being reactive without an explanation as to why. And that's sort of where I sat. Despite being told that I would never be able to reintroduce gluten, that gluten was something I had to break up with and I'd never be able to get back into my life, here I am in this very odd spot. And I don't regret it. So I want to talk just very briefly about what gluten is, where it's found, and some of the research that has been really fascinating to me that's shaped not only my opinion about gluten and why I will still utilize a gluten-free diet to some degree when I'm working with clients. Now, Gluten is this kind of like very gluey, spongy protein that's found in certain grains, most notably wheat. But it's also found in barley, rye, typically oats that have been contaminated and then spelt. And so I spent a lot of time educating people on this. In fact, I had my website from 2010 to almost about 2019, all about educating people on living a gluten-free lifestyle and why you should take out gluten and why it was bad for you. And part of that was based on a lot of research that I had looked at that time. And I think we were just starting to really truly understand the magnitude of things like celiac disease. And this is just my own thoughts on this, but I'm not speaking for any other functional practitioner out there. But I kind of feel like we took research that was really starting to understand what celiac disease was, and we applied it to everything. And that really wasn't fair. Because people who have celiac disease, that is not the same as being sensitive to gluten. And I think to some degree, it may have done a disservice to people who truly do have celiac disease because we tried to equate the two, using research on the more integrative and functional side to justify everybody removing gluten, claiming that gluten in and of itself was inherently inflammatory, not considering all these other factors about wheat, most notably, that is potentially problematic or could be problematic in varying ways. We do know from research that gluten increases gut permeability, or leaky gut, if you want to call it that. So we know that from research that Dr. Alessio Fasano has done. And the research paper that I had looked at, which was super fascinating, looked at gluten ingestion of those who had no confirmed issue with gluten whatsoever, those with gluten sensitivity, and those who had celiac disease. And what they looked at was how permeable did gluten make their respective guts, and then could they see basically would the gut revert back to its original state? And so those with celiac disease, it doesn't revert back. I mean, there's definitely damage done. Those who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity would see a much slower, to some degree, improvement in gut tolerance. But generally speaking, it would still cause an issue, but not necessarily damage that's caused within celiac disease, right? Again, they're very different conditions. So it's about tolerance. And so that's one of the reasons why even now when I work with clients, typically I will just ask them to remove gluten while we're doing our work, whatever is going on in the GI tract. And a lot of times there's a lot of issues going on in the GI tract. I want to try and keep it as contained as possible to the gut, because as we increase permeability, as we increase leakiness, then we have more exposure systemically to inflammation. And then eventually I like to encourage clients to reintroduce, obviously some of the more sourdough forms, older forms of wheat, which I'll talk about in a moment. But, one of the things that I realized was that we blamed all of these gut symptoms and even extra intestinal symptoms that occur outside of the GI tract, like headaches, brain fog, etc. We blamed all of that on gluten itself, even though gluten exists in high FODMAP foods. And so a lot of times that can be a sign of SIBO, or small intestine bacterial overgrowth, but nobody really looked for that because they just assumed it was gluten. So we just sort of gave this catch-all, oh, you have gluten sensitivity, oh, I'm sensitive to gluten, even though there could have actually been something greater going on. I think there was a lot of issues that we were leaving on the table by just blaming gluten and not digging deeper into cases, partly because the technology of even looking at stool testing has really evolved. It's still not perfect, but it's more evolved now than it was like 10, 15 years ago. And if you do have celiac disease or you have a diagnosed wheat allergy, this conversation's really not for you, because this is for those of us who got lumped into this gluten sensitivity situation. Just because you get diagnosed with some other type of autoimmune condition doesn't necessarily mean that you can't consider reintroduction. I had a lot of people with Hashimoto's thyroiditis reach out to me and ask me if they could possibly consume sourdough. And I think it really depends on the state that your condition is in. But that being said, I don't think that it's fair to just blame all autoimmunity and worsening autoimmunity on gluten. Now, if you go back and listen to my episode with Dr. Bill Schindler, you'll actually discover that there's a huge difference between bread products that sit on the shelf that are like this white, fluffy, beautiful bread loaf versus something that's sourdough, especially one that's organic and that is mixing up a bunch of really nutritious different flours and then is fermented. So I think we have to have a more nuanced conversation. The kind of like black and white days of like going, oh, gluten bad, gluten-free good is over, because we know that that's not true. And I just want to give you some of my reasons why. While it has been this kind of overarching theme to just remove gluten as a blanket statement, and I understand that a lot of that was driven from this idea of reducing inflammation that drives autoimmunity. And I do see that it can be helpful, but I think it's a starting point. It should not be a place where you just get to and stay and go, oh, this is the end all be all. Unless, again, you have celiac disease or a wheat allergy. That's a different story. But for most people, what they're getting is you've got to remove gluten. You're going to probably be off of it for the rest of your life. And, as long as you follow this really kind of like strict elimination diet, again, very fixated on diet as being the solution to everything, then you'll be good, right? Your autoimmune condition will, correct itself. Your antibodies will come down, blah, 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 whatever it is that you're reading. And I'm not saying that it can't be helpful. I just get worried when we make these statements of it being the end all be all. And that's because there's a huge component to the gut microbiome and that interplay with autoimmunity. And there are cytokines that I've talked about that, we see within skin conditions that also show up in different autoimmune conditions. So gluten exposure is not going to fix that. It's not going to stop that. So I think that's where we sort of need to take a step back and understand the complexity of these different chronic health conditions a little bit more and have an honest conversation about how much diet can be helpful, because it's really easy to just want to believe that diet in and of itself is going to fix everything. It's like, I literally just got done watching the apple cider vinegar documentary drama type situation, and I understand it's not exact and they dramatized a lot of it. It's on Netflix, but it's a really, really good reminder that we have to ask harder questions. We have to use discernment in order to determine whether these steps that we're being encouraged to do, how realistic is it that it's going to make, a huge, massive, life-changing shift in your diet and in your life ultimately, and in these symptoms. And so I do think that a gluten-free diet can improve some levels of inflammation. It's obviously easier to tackle than going down the route of really digging into more expensive testing and doing lots of protocols. So I get that. It's really easy. It's something you can implement on your own. But I will be honest, a lot of gluten-free options are subpar, especially from a nutritional standpoint. They include tons of processed ingredients. They tend to have a higher glycemic index. There's a lot of GMO crops that are used, especially when corn flour is involved. Rice flour has its own problems with a lot of the rice having a higher arsenic content. And many of these products and foods are just more expensive. So yes, there's naturally gluten-free foods, which is wonderful, and I encourage clients to learn all about. But even if you go out to a restaurant and you try to get the gluten-free option, you're going to be charged somewhere between an extra $3 to maybe $5 on top of your meal, unless you're just simply asking them to remove things. But how awful is it that you go and you only have like a burger patty and a little side salad and you don't get any of the other meal, but you still have to pay full price, right? So you're still paying a surcharge in order to eat this way. Now, again, I'm not necessarily saying that we should all be eating these very processed versions of gluten either. There's problems with that, as I've already shared. But I think a lot of this, while yes, gluten-free is more accessible today than it was when I started. And for those of you who hate gluten-free options today, let me tell you, in 2008, I was going to say 2018, but no, 2008, when I started out on a gluten-free diet, the food was so bad. I remember the rice tortilla that I bought, I think the brand still exists today, was like eating cardboard. It was so bad. I've since had, there's a bakery here in Philadelphia that is, I think she's a French pastry chef. She does gluten-free French pastries. I mean, they're wonderful if you haven't had gluten, but they're not the same. There is no comparison. And I will admit that traveling to other countries can be a real challenge. Traveling to other cities can be a real challenge. Traveling with family members who don't understand that you need to eat gluten-free and who don't care can be a challenge. I will add that going to Italy is really easy being gluten-free. I've been there many, many times. I don't even need to do like a ton of research because everywhere has gluten-free options. But that being said, that's not the case for most places. I mean, even when I go visit my sister, not everywhere has gluten-free options. And she lives in California. She lives outside of San Francisco. So you can't assume that just because it's a major metropolitan area that it's going to be as gluten-free friendly as, say, New York. New York City is really gluten-free friendly, but other cities aren't quite. I mean, I would even argue I've had some issues like when I've gone to LA. It's not always easy. There's definitely options, but it just depends on where you are, who you're with, all sorts of pieces to this. And if we look at it from a processed food perspective, we're pushing people into processed foods. And I know that you can eat a gluten-free diet that is more whole foods based. I'm aware of that. But the reality of it is that most people want to swap out what they're used to with the gluten-free alternatives. And those gluten-free alternatives tend to be more processed and less nutritious and higher glycemic. Again, those are some of my big concerns. And the fact that we never really took a hard look to ask ourselves, what could be driving these autoimmune conditions? And is it possible, maybe this is one facet of it, but is it possible that there is this point where we could regain tolerance to gluten by adjusting not only our nervous system, our gut microbiome, working on gut function, all these different things, that we could address all the different holes that are causing water to well up within your proverbial boat and actually be able to reintroduce foods. So anyway, I want to share with you guys some things that you can do if you're really seriously thinking about reintroducing gluten like I did. So what I'm about to share with you is the way that I reintroduced gluten. I would not recommend this for somebody who is diagnosed with celiac disease or who has a wheat allergy. And I'm just giving those two caveats because I feel like sometimes people only hear parts of things, or you listen or tune in to parts of episodes. And this is really important because obviously these two conditions are medical conditions that really seriously are impacted by what I'm about to say. But one of the reasons that I'm really glad that I did this, and I think it's important to share beforehand, is a number of months ago, I went to visit a friend and her family in Mexico City. I hadn't seen her in a number of years. And she and I, have had a long shared history of things. And we just, because of COVID, we just hadn't seen each other in a long time. And so I'll never forget the one night she placed an order for a bunch of different sourdough pies. And I was able to eat that with them, to be a part of this really beautiful evening of laughter, of making memories, of talking about things that had happened and reliving things that we had both shared. And through all that, we were connected by this little kind of a pizza party with sourdough. And so I loved the fact that I could enjoy what everyone else was enjoying, that I didn't have to worry about what was in the food, that I was able to partake. And listen, I totally feel for you if this is not possible for you. I really, really, truly do. So I don't want you to think like that I'm saying that there's something inherently wrong with not being able to consume what everybody else is eating. But it definitely does, to some degree, make you feel left out of the community. And so having that really beautiful memory, I'm so grateful that I was able to have that. I had started thinking about reintroducing gluten probably about 8 months earlier. So there was a bakery, which I've actually had Dr. Bill Schindler on the Healthy Skin Show to talk about this because it's his bakery with his wife, Christina. They run it. And it was a sourdough, like a true sourdough bakery located in Chestertown, Maryland. And my mother and my husband were constantly like buying little goodies and different things. And I was just like, okay, I guess like this is nice, but I can't eat any of this. And so it started the process of really sitting with asking questions, becoming more comfortable with their process, having conversations with their team about how they ferment their food. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say sourdough bread is gluten-free. That's not true. It is not gluten-free. So if people are telling you that, that is not true. It does break down gluten and make it more digestible, but I think the claim that it is gluten-free is patently false. So just be aware of that. And so I started there with a 3-day ferment, which happened to be, of all things, their croissants. I know. Worst thing in the world, right? A buttery croissant. I had a gluten-free croissant a number of times. Nope. Doesn't compare. So that's where I started. And actually the first time I tried it, I tried half of the croissant and I wasn't sure if it was bothering me or not. I just wasn't sure. I think there's a hypervigilance that comes with reintroducing any type of food where you're like, oh my gosh, is every sensation this amplification of some internal sign that I shouldn't be doing this, right? Because we're just so conditioned to be afraid of food. Unfortunately, that is something that many of us have had experience with. And so I ate the other half the next day and I was fine. And I started with the 3-day ferments and then eventually I tried their sourdough, which is a 1-day ferment, and I was fine. I have been able to eat everything from their bakery, including their sourdough pizza, their soft pretzels. I know it sounds like I'm eating this stuff all the time. I'm not, but it just to be able over the last almost year to enjoy these things has been, I don't know. I maybe it's an excuse that I'm Italian and I love food, but there's just so much flavor and quality, and there's nothing like that flaky crust that you have with a croissant that's made from wheat. So here's my suggestions if you want to reintroduce gluten. The first thing I would say is really sit with, is the internal barometer that you feel, is it food fear? Or is it a legitimate inner knowing that this is not right for you just yet? If you have a whole lot of symptoms, so you're very symptomatic in whatever it is that you are dealing with, that's probably not the time to try to reintroduce gluten. Obviously, we're all adults here. You make the decision of what's best for you, but you might want to hold off a bit and keep doing some underlying work and see if you can get yourself to a more stable place. That being said, do not ever reintroduce multiple types of foods that you've eliminated at the same time, because if you do react to something, you don't actually know what it is that you reacted to. So when I reintroduced the gluten croissant, it was the only thing that I had never eaten before in that meal. And so I knew that if I reacted, I knew what it was. The other thing that I will share is I really do think that starting with sourdough is by far the best, smartest move, as opposed to just trying some type of gluten-y bread, even if it was whole wheat that you find at, regular bakery. The other thing that is really important, if you did not watch Dr. Bill Schindler's episode, which I'll link up in the show notes, you didn't tune into that, please do, because there's a lot of fake sourdough that's sold at grocery stores. And if you're just looking for a sourdough label and you're like, okay, let me reintroduce this, you're probably not reintroducing sourdough. Sourdough is not regulated in the United States, so you can't just grab something that it's not that readily available. So just keep that in mind. We go over all of that, of how to look for true sourdough in that particular episode. The other thing that you could possibly try to graduate out to, and I have not gotten there yet, so I'm just being very straight with you all about where I am in my journey. There are older forms of wheat, specifically spelt, kamut, and einkorn, that may be more tolerable because it's considered a more ancient form of wheat, and the gluten is different than the gluten that tends to be found in our wheat today, the more modern form of wheat. I would also, if you are going to do this, try your best to stick to organic flours. And if, like me, you're going to start to make your own sourdough, one thing that I've come to be a little mindful of is you have to make sure that the wheat that you purchase and use is stored properly, and that it is within its date of use. I think there's I could be wrong about this, but about a 3-month shelf life on a bag of flour. So old flour can get moldy. Sometimes the flour bags can get moldy and you can end up with moldy flour. And obviously that's not good. So we just want to keep in mind that you don't want moldy flours. And then if you have them, make sure to store them properly. Don't just close the paper bag and put a clip on it. You really want to seal it in something like a Tupperware container of some sort or something, so that we're really trying to keep it as dry and contained as possible to protect the nutrition and that it doesn't become moldy. The gentle reminder, right, is to do this with grace, to approach your health and to approach this process with grace, because healing can take time. And despite the many, many functional and integrative books that have been on the market of like the 21-day fix back to yourself or whatever it may be, the truth is that when you're living with chronic illness, and that can vary in degree, obviously, and in severity, it can take time. My journey was 16 years. I probably delayed a lot of things because of food fear. That's why I said we need to use discernment. I think we do have inner knowing about certain things, but we oftentimes, that can be overridden, unfortunately, by this fear that gets instilled into us by others and by things that we read, things that we expose ourselves to practitioners who are really fixated on just food being the problem and demonizing the food. And so that is something that's going to be important for you to really sit with. And it took me time. It took me a lot of months of asking questions over and over and over again before I felt comfortable finally giving it a shot, knowing that it might not have been a good time. And if that was the case, I would have just probably waited another 6 to 8 months before I tried to reintroduce again to see if I could have it. Just given that wheat in and of itself is a top 9 allergen, it always is good to have some Zyrtec on hand. I learned from interviewing a lot of allergists that Zyrtec's actually a better thing than Benadryl to have on hand, just in case you were to start to develop an allergic reaction, because we can trigger allergies to foods that we have eliminated. So we just want to be mindful of that. But in general, there is a bit of joy. There is a really important bit of joy that I got back into my life when I was able to start reintroducing this. And again, it's not gluttonous. It's like connection and memories and feeling a part of something. And I'll just share as a final point. One of my most treasured memories was visiting family friends in Bologna, Italy. And the mother made everything from scratch, including the tagliatelle, which is similar to it's like a thicker linguine. She made everything from scratch herself. So I got to have fresh tagliatelle alla bolognese, which was to die for. And on that balcony overlooking a parking lot, I got to eat with these family friends. It was the most amazing meal with the most amazing people. And it feels like I was able to finally reclaim a part of myself, that I don't have to be as worried about everything all the time. And so I just want to share that with you. This has really changed my life for the better, because I am working on those final pieces of myself that I had essentially cut out and demonized, and I didn't need to. It may have served a purpose in my healing journey, and I think for clients initially it can serve a real purpose, but I think long term we do ourselves a disservice by constantly telling people to cut everything out as if it's the food's fault and never looking deeper. So if you're like me and you want to try and reintroduce gluten, I hope this gives you good food for thought. I would absolutely love to hear if you've gone down the route of sourdough, how that has impacted you. Are you making it yourself? Are you getting it from a local bakery? How is it playing with your system? Or if you're on the flip side where you haven't quite crossed over to this, you're thinking about it, you're considering it, what's the hang up right now for you? What are you worried about? What are you considering? What are the questions that you really need to ask and explore to help you find your footing, to find that safety, to take, I don't know why, but it was like I asked enough questions as if it was filling up this like well of courage to give it a shot. And I'm really, really grateful that I was willing to do that. Even if it didn't work out, I'm glad that I did it regardless. So I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Please share your experience, and I'll put a link in the description with all of the different resources and the other episodes I've mentioned here, so you can go check them out. We'll also have the full transcript at skinterrupt.com/391. And if you're here watching this, tuning in, and you have thought about how you can fix your skin because you're just looking for a way to not have this be the thing that's driving you nuts in your life and sucking all the joy out of your life, I've got a really great guide for you. You can head to stopmyrashesnow.com. It'll help you figure out what those hidden triggers are driving the rashes, driving the symptoms under the surface, and then it'll point you toward the next action steps based on your specific skin diagnosis. And then remember to hit the thumbs up if you really enjoyed this content, because I'm happy to make more content like this, and then subscribe so that way you get notified every time new content drops. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. If you enjoyed this video, you need to tune in to this video next. Then make sure to hit the subscribe button so you get notified as soon as a new episode drops. I'm excited to see you there and dive deeper with you on your skin healing journey.